Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Imagine you walk into a room, and the physical space is packed floor to ceiling with objects.
Right.
The pathways are narrowed to the exact width of a human body, and items are layered into these dense, unyielding formations.
Yeah.
If you have ever observed an environment filled beyond its physical capacity like this, your first reaction might be confusion or even frustration.
Oh, absolutely.
The initial question most people form when viewing these spaces is simply, why won't the individual just clean this up?
Exactly.
It seems like an obvious physical problem requiring a basic physical solution. But what if the act of cleaning up is the exact thing that threatens the individual's psychological survival?
That is the exact reframe we are examining today in this deep dive.
Yeah.
Asking why someone does not simply remove the objects is, well, it's a logical question on the surface, but it is fundamentally imprecise.
Right.
That question assumes that what is visible to the eye is sufficient to explain what is occurring within the mind.
I see.
It operates on the incorrect assumption that the physical accumulation of items is the primary issue to be solved, rather than a symptom of a highly complex internal system.
And that system is precisely what we are exploring today.
Mm-hmm.
The mission of this deep dive is to perform a strict analytical examination of hoarding.
Yes.
To do this, we are relying exclusively on R.J. Starr's essay, The Psychology of Hoarding, What We Cannot Let Go Of.
A fantastic text.
We are going to look entirely at the mechanisms of hoarding as presented in this specific text, bypassing all the usual assumptions about organization or, simple discipline.
To accurately understand this behavior, you have to utilize R.J. Starr's specific framework, which is introduced in the text as psychological architecture.
Right, the psychological architecture.
Yes. This framework requires a complete shift in observation. You must stop looking at the visible accumulation of the physical objects.
Okay.
Instead, you have to examine the invisible psychological machinery operating underneath that accumulation.
Underneath it, yeah.
Within this architecture, R.J. Starr analyzes hoarding across 4 specific domains: emotion, identity, mind, and meaning.
Okay, let's unpack this framework. R.J. Starr's central thesis is that hoarding is not a failure of discipline, and it is certainly not a mere failure of organization.
No, not at all.
It is instead a patterned response where objects are actively utilized to stabilize a psychological system.
Precisely. The question you must ask when evaluating these environments is not why someone keeps so much material.
Right.
The question you have to ask is, what exactly is being stabilized through the act of keeping these items?
Right. If we accept R.J. Starr's premise that hoarding is not fundamentally about the physical objects themselves, we have to look at what precise function these objects are performing.
Yes, exactly.
So let's start with the first domain R.J. Starr outlines, which is emotion. If the items are not just clutter, what are they doing?
Well, in R.J. Starr's domain of emotion, objects function strictly as emotional regulators.
Emotional regulators.
Right. Within this framework, an object is never neutral. It acquires profound significance through direct association.
Okay, how so?
For instance, the text explains that a photograph is not merely processed as paper and ink. It functions as a preserved moment.
Wow, okay.
A piece of clothing is not simply processed as fabric. It functions as a tangible trace of a past role or a version of the self that once existed.
So the object holds a literal emotional weight that the person's internal mind cannot process or carry on its own.
Exactly. The individual's internal psychological system is unable to maintain emotional equilibrium independently.
Right.
Therefore, the objects begin to serve as external stabilizers for emotional experience. They carry the emotional data.
I mean, that makes sense.
Because the objects hold this data, discarding an item is not experienced by the individual as a neutral physical act of tidying a room.
No.
It is experienced as a direct loss. The system interprets the removal of the physical object as the literal removal of the memory, the connection, or the specific sense of safety that the item represents.
Okay, I have to challenge this logic based on the visible reality of the environments R.J. Starr describes.
Sure.
Because if a space becomes so physically overwhelming that a person can no longer sleep in their bed or cook in their kitchen, why doesn't an intervention to clear out the objects bring the individual relief?
Right. That's the obvious question.
I mean, if the accumulation is causing severe physical constraint, wouldn't the removal of that constraint alleviate the psychological burden?
It is a common assumption. But if you look at the mechanics through R.J. Starr's analysis, you see exactly why forced physical interventions fail so reliably.
Okay, why is that?
When this dynamic of attachment is repeated across thousands of individual objects, the regulation of emotion is no longer occurring internally at all.
Oh, wow.
The regulation has been completely distributed across the physical room. The space is no longer just a cluttered bedroom or living room. It has become saturated with emotional function.
Oh, saturated.
Yes, each individual item is actively participating in maintaining the person's equilibrium.
So, because the regulation is distributed across the room, removing items is not experienced as cleaning.
Correct. Removing items is experienced as deregulation.
Deregulation.
Yes, the physical environment is the regulatory system. When you remove an object, you are removing a vital component of that system.
Taking that a step further, the removal of the objects is perceived as a direct threat to the individual's baseline equilibrium.
Yes, absolutely. The individual responds to that forced deregulation with extreme distress, which often leads to rapid compensatory reaccumulation.
So they just acquire more things immediately.
Exactly. The behavior persists entirely because the objects are serving a regulatory role that has not been replaced by any functioning internal mechanism.
Right.
Until the internal regulation is established, the external regulation, meaning the objects cannot be safely removed.
Understanding that objects function to anchor emotions explains the intense attachment to them. It explains why a person cannot simply throw a newspaper away if that newspaper is regulating an underlying anxiety.
Yes, precisely.
But this leads to another question about the timeline of this behavior. Like, why does hoarding suddenly intensify or spiral out of control during specific observable phases of an individual's life?
Well, this brings us to R.J. Starr's second domain, which is identity.
Identity, okay.
The text notes that hoarding frequently intensifies during periods of profound disruption. This includes events such as the loss of a loved one, the end of a long-term relationship, a major relocation, or retirement.
Retirement.
Yes. Retirement, for example, is the dissolution of a professional role that previously structured the individual's daily life and internal sense of purpose.
Right, so these events are not just stressful milestones.
Yeah.
They are severe life alterations that fundamentally compromise the continuity of the self.
That is the exact mechanism. Continuity is the unbroken sequence of a person's understanding of who they are over time.
Right.
When a disruption breaks that sequence, the internal sense of identity fragments.
So when the internal continuity of the self weakens, the psychological system attempts to compensate by extending outward. It recruits the physical environment to do the job the internal mind can no longer do.
Exactly.
The system uses objects to provide evidence. They provide tangible confirmation that a specific version of the self existed and was real, thereby creating continuity externally where the internal sense of continuity has been compromised.
What's fascinating here is the physical consequence of this compensation. Within this framework, discarding an object under these conditions is not just reducing the physical volume of items in a house.
No.
Because the objects are providing evidence of the self, discarding an item is experienced as erasing a piece of the identity network.
So the object is quite literally a component of the externalized framework holding the person's identity in place.
Yes. The system is actively using the objects to carry what it can no longer hold with stability on its own.
Wow.
It is maintaining the identity in the face of fragmentation.
And while this external system inevitably grows in physical density, making the environment incredibly difficult to navigate, R.J. Starr argues that the behavior remains completely coherent from within the system.
It is very coherent.
The individual is preserving evidence of the self that feels at imminent risk of being lost.
Precisely. If the internal mind feels it is disappearing, retaining physical proof of existence is a highly logical protective response, regardless of how much floor space that proof requires.
This brings up a critical functional issue, though.
Okay.
If these objects are holding a person's identity together, how does the mind process the physical task of organizing or sorting them?
Right.
If you ask an individual to clear the space, why does the basic mechanical process of decision-making break down so completely?
Well, in R.J. Starr's domain of mind, observers often mislabel this breakdown. They observe an individual holding an item for several minutes and assume it is simple indecision.
Right, like they just can't make up their mind.
Exactly. They assume the individual just cannot figure out what they want to keep.
Mhm.
But R.J. Starr identifies a much deeper failure occurring in the brain. It is a systemic breakdown of differentiation.
This is the concept R.J. Starr defines as salience distortion.
Yes, salience distortion.
Let's break down exactly how this operates, because it is central to the accumulation.
Salience refers to the prominence or importance of a given piece of information.
Okay.
In a functioning cognitive system, items are constantly ranked by their relative importance. For example, a birth certificate is clearly significant, and a piece of generic junk mail is clearly not.
Right. Obvious difference.
This capacity to assign relative significance is what defines the boundary between what is kept and what is released. In a hoarding environment, that internal calibration fails entirely.
Because the system cannot accurately calibrate importance, it cannot accurately rule anything out.
Yes.
When the ranking algorithm breaks down, the junk mail and the birth certificate register as equally important to the brain.
Exactly.
Every single object carries potential value. Everything could matter in a way that is not yet fully processed by the system. Therefore, since the individual cannot determine what is safe to discard, the safest cognitive move is retention.
The decision to keep a seemingly useless item is not based on a clear, positive valuation of that item. It is based entirely on the system's inability to confidently dismiss it.
But how does this inability to differentiate escalate into the extreme, unyielding environments that R.J. Starr describes?
Whoa.
Like, a breakdown in sorting explains why it might take someone longer to clean a room, but how does it create the sheer, overwhelming density of a hoarded house?
It creates a highly specific escalating feedback loop.
A feedback loop.
Yes, as more items are retained simply because they cannot be ruled out, the physical volume in the room increases.
Right.
Simultaneously, the cognitive load on the individual increases. The brain is now surrounded by thousands of items, each demanding processing power.
Wow, okay.
The system becomes heavily taxed by the sheer volume of visual information and physical material it must navigate.
And because the cognitive system is more taxed by the environment, differentiation becomes even harder.
Exactly. The taxed brain loses even more capacity to rank importance. This continually raises the threshold for discarding anything.
What might have been easy to throw away yesterday becomes impossible to process today because the cognitive load is too high.
That makes total sense.
The massive accumulation is not a deliberate strategy at this stage. It is simply the default outcome of an impaired filtering mechanism. Because nothing can be definitively dismissed, everything must be retained.
If the mind is trapped in this relentless feedback loop where everything has a potential value and nothing can be safely dismissed, what does the actual physical act of discarding an item represent to the individual?
This requires us to transition into R.J. Starr's final domain.
Meaning.
Yes, this domain examines the finality of the physical object.
Here's where it gets really interesting. In the domain of meaning, R.J. Starr outlines that hoarding is essentially a resistance to closure. The accumulation is a physical manifestation of unmade decisions.
That is the core mechanism of this final domain. To physically discard an object is to make a definitive statement.
Right. It declares that the item no longer has a role, that its potential has been entirely exhausted, and that its function has reached a permanent endpoint.
Keeping an object, however, preserves possibility.
Yes.
The object might be useful in the future. It might connect to a project not yet realized. It might be needed by a family member a decade from now.
Exactly.
Structurally, retaining the object ensures that its status remains open and unresolved.
Discarding the object collapses that openness. It transforms a possibility into a definitive conclusion.
And for a psychological system that is actively struggling with the concept of finality, perhaps because of the identity disruptions or the emotional losses we discussed earlier, closure is not experienced as a neutral resolution.
No.
Closure is processed as erasure.
Yes. If a system is terrified of endpoints, it will avoid creating them. The hoarded environment, therefore, becomes a vast physical field of suspended decisions.
Suspended decisions, wow.
The layers of objects are a method of holding open what the psychological system is not yet prepared to close. It is a strict physical refusal of finality.
Pulling together these four domains, emotion, identity, mind, and meaning, reveals the ultimate paradox of the behavior.
It does.
We have established, using R.J. Starr's framework, that objects act as emotional regulators.
Right.
They act as tangible evidence to preserve the continuity of identity when the sum is fragmented. We understand that the cognitive system suffers from salience distortion, making the basic differentiation between important and unimportant items impossible.
Yes.
And finally, the retention of these objects preserves future possibility while actively resisting closure and finality.
When you view the architecture comprehensively, you see that the accumulation is not random. Each retained object is performing a highly specific, necessary function for the individual's psychological system at that exact moment.
So what does this all mean? R.J. Starr's analysis leads to a very specific structural conclusion about the nature of this behavior.
Yes, it does.
At the micro level of the individual decision, the moment person decides to put an item down rather than throw it away, the retention of the object is completely coherent.
Completely coherent.
Retaining the object prevents immediate emotional loss. It avoids the difficult, taxing cognitive demand of differentiation. It maintains possibility. In that single moment, keeping the item successfully reduces strain on the psychological system.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you arrive at the overarching conundrum of accumulation. The behavior works locally, but it fails globally.
Fails globally.
Yes. The individual decisions to retain objects successfully create stability in the immediate moment. The system regulates the anxiety of that specific second. However, the sheer physical accumulation of those local decisions generates profound instability over time. The environment becomes completely saturated. The physical space that once supported the individual's life becomes structurally unlivable.
The system persists in a pattern that actively undermines it. The mechanism designed to keep the individual safe ultimately trapped them.
It does, and it persists in that destructive pattern simply because each individual step of that pattern effectively solves an immediate problem for the person. The tension is absolute. Hoarding is a stabilization strategy that eventually collapses the very framework it was attempting to support, because the mind prioritizes the immediate regulation of anxiety over the long-term viability of the physical environment.
You are left to consider the profound tension of R.J. Starr's analysis. Hoarding is not a failure of character, nor is it a willful refusal to organize a space.
No.
It is the reality of a psychological system that persists in a pattern that actively undermines its own survival, strictly because each individual step of that pattern effectively solves an immediate problem of emotional and structural regulation. The behavior continues because, in the immediate calculation of the mind, the cost of discarding an item is always higher than the cost of keeping it.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.